Hello, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of the Epistle to the Hebrews. As scholars have been telling us, a most unusual book in the New Testament canon. We are in chapter 9. I had the first lesson off of this chapter last week, where the author is explaining how Christ is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Jeremiah 31. In last week's class, we reviewed the sort of the property and cultural rituals performed by the earthly high priest in the temple, specifically the temple in the wilderness. In that lesson, the scripture ended with verse 10 of chapter 9, which in some versions of the New Revised Standard version it could be paraphrased to imply, but those rituals deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time comes to set things right. Today's class describes the new things that happen to set things right. So let's read the next 11 verses, 11 through 23. I'm sorry, 11 through 22. But when Christ came as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of his creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of a goat and calf, but with his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. For if the blood of a goat and bull, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled, so that their flesh is purified, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemishes to God, purifying our conscience from dead works to worship the living God. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, because a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions under the first covenant. Where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Hence, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment has been told to all the people by Moses, in accordance with the law, he took the blood of a calf and goat with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the scrolls and sprinkled both the scrolls itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God has ordained for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. Dr. Eugene Boring and Dr. Fred Craddock, two disciple scholars, in their New Testament commentary, open this reading with the opinion statement of the following: the purpose of Christ's sacrifice for us is in order that we may worship and serve the living God. Early, two things were mentioned that are counted as good things of the Christ Scripture. Those are access to God and the perfection of the human conscience. In these opening verses today, uh, reading, these same two scholars say, in a straightforward sense, the phrasing there means Christ went through the tent, entering most holy place, or the Holy of Holies in heaven, which is where God is. He entered it once for all, not just for himself. Christ is in this heavenly sanctuary, in the actual presence of God is the idea here. He's not on an earthly, meeting us on an earthly tent, and he has entered it for us all, and not just for the 12 tribes of Israel. Such is a sharp contrast to the repetitive activities of the Levitical priesthood Kraddic rites. In other words, in the system under the Old Covenant, all these ritual ceremonies had to be repeated depending on what was involved, either daily or once a year. Christ has secured redemption that is eternal and not repeated. It is an eschatological finality, is the idea presented here in verses 11 through 14. Christ and the new covenant have changed access reality related to God and the perfection of the human conscience of the individual believer. These are the big points. Some scholars say this area here in chapter 9 helps us better understand the remark in the Synoptic Gospel that the curtain was ripped on the day of crucifixion at the moment of death of Christ. Christ willingly offered his own blood for the atonement of sin, not that of another animal. That is, Christ offered his own life to God on behalf of others. Yes, he had a hard prayer in the garden there with God on the eve before. But in obedience to God's will, he obeyed. Thus Christ has secured redemption that is eternal, is there in verse 12. You do not see that word redemption used very much in the New Testament, yet it was a common metaphor term being used for salvation in Judaism of the time of the New Testament writings. Thus Christ's high priestly ministry is on our behalf, taught Dr. Kraddic. It involves intercession and self-sacrifice. The essential elements here is the blood. This is what Hebrews is pointing out. Christ's own blood in the case of the eternal sacrifice. The high priest normally used blood and sprinkling it on the mercy seat and other things around during this annual atonement ceremony. On the Day of Atonement, behind the curtain, but Christ offers himself, his own blood, not that of a goat for the people, nor that of a bullock for himself, because he had no sin. And it was offered on our behalf, is the message. To make, and why was it done? Specifically to make atonement, to reconnect us fully and finally with God, is Hebrews' point. It is not this is eternal in that it does not just last for 1 year like it did under the Old Covenant. And then had to be repeated on a yearly basis. No, this is a one-time event, and it's eternal. The jump from Christ's sacrifice on earth, on an earthly cross, and that event is then not consummated until Christ is in heaven, is not explained here in Hebrews. It is also an area of considerable debate among scholars. They debate as to whether Christ's death on the cross was atoning in itself, but nothing more than a human event under Roman rule, and that the atonement did not really start until Christ's entrance into God's presence in heaven. We may think this is a minor deal, but we see this being a big issue in some Christian denominations. We see, for example, those Christian religious groups that consider ascension of Christ to be theologically the more significant event in the church calendar, as taking this issue quite seriously and deeply. The author suddenly refers to the ceremony of the ashes of the red heifer. It's not clear in some translations, especially. In the one I read here today, an older version of the New Revised Standard Version, it's a little clearer. I found no scholar, though, in the several writing commentaries that I've reviewed, who really did very much other than acknowledging that it was there. But in Numbers, when you go back into Numbers, where this, the book of Numbers, where this red heifer event is involved, it's an extra effort involved in purification, over and above. And so the point that's being made here is that even the most extreme sacrificial events that occurred under the Old Covenant are insufficient to achieve forgiveness of sins. That's essentially, I think, the point that's being made. It appears the material in verses 15 through 22 are more there to clarify the link between the atoning sacrifice or sacrifices and establishment of a new covenant, says Dr. Attridge at Yale. Jeremiah clearly talks, he says, about establishing a new covenant, but not a sacrifice connected with it. So that connection is the author's own midrash, he says, that is, the author's own interpretation here. It appears he assumes the sacrifice was an inaugural event for this atonement, and therefore he gets to that point through a series of deductive logical steps that we'll see develop further later. The focus in verses 15 through 22 is clearly the connection between the sacrifice and the new covenant. Scholars say under the old system, the old cultic ritual system of sacrifices and laws, the covenant was clearly joined with those laws and with those sacrifices. So some scholars say that Hebrews could be easily assumed that the Hebrew people, anyway, would easily assume that if there was a change in sacrifice, therefore there would be a different covenant. And that's part of why he's going into this type of detailed step and logical development for these people. They may seem like a big jump for us, but would not have for the Hebrews of that time. Thus, the focus of Hebrews up to this point has been on the sacrifices, because if the sacrifices change, then that's a signal to them that there is something very different going on. And so the issue here is that the sacrifices have changed. Christ himself was the sacrifice. In verse 16 through 17, the writer argues that the necessity of Christ's death for the inauguration of the new covenant was the key event. That, says Dr. Fred Craddock, he uses the Greek word translated here, that's covenant, and uses will in this case, or English writers, English translators, use the word will. to explain that a covenant or will is not executed as long as the person is alive, that it's only executed upon death. So in verse 22, the author states what he considers a general truth for the time, which is still a truth today. Under the law of the time, almost everything is purified with blood, ceremonially implied here. That is, almost everything had a blood ritual of cleansing tied to it in that culture. Thus, without shedding the blood, there is no putting away or removal or forgetting of sins, is the meaning of this covenant. It's not been activated. The will has not been activated or executed legally if there's not been a death, if there's not been a sacrifice, in other words. Dr. Eugene Boring at Bright Divinity says, we readers must place ourselves in the cultural context of that ancient community of Hebrews to get that point. Using the vocabulary and mindset of our modern society to interpret it does not work here. He was not preaching to us, but to a Hebrew society in mid-1st century AD. And he says, therefore, that's why it's important for us to go back and understand what that Old Testament has to say about these things, to understand the concepts that were in vogue for this Hebrew audience, because the Hebrews are trying to step back and leave the Christian community due to some sort of stress. The point in verse 15 probably would have been especially pertinent, he says, to a Hebrew audience who is presumed in this case to be Jewish Christians, that is, Hebrews previously fully in cult with the Jewish faith and have adopted Christianity. But some stress comes about, and they now are considering returning to the faith. That tends to be where most scholars think an audience of this sort is where this is being written to. As Boring says, they were ready to jump ship. The point being made here is that it is through Christ that they promised eternal inheritance from the first covenant will be made. That's a key point, is that the first covenant has been made null and void by the establishment of a second covenant. Thus, although not said here, some scholars say this implied meaning is if you jump ship now, you in return to your old faith, you miss the only real opportunity you have for salvation, because the reconciliation with God is through Christ, and the second covenant, as the first, is now null because it was ineffective. The implied message is the one that Paul probably finally understood. He is essentially preaching the same thing. He interprets it slightly different, but he's preaching much the same thing, and many people say this is probably why Paul was credited with this writing, because that's the closest tie we have in the New Testament, Paul's writings to Hebrews. The implied message is one that Paul preached, Paul understood. Christ is the only game in town, says Fred Craddock. And as Paul called it, and it was that game that reconciled humans to God. That was Paul's understanding of it. Scholars today feel fairly certain this is not a writing of Paul, but Paul understood this. The writer of Hebrews and the writer of Paul are very good evidence they're not the same. They're not consistent, but there is a general understanding, a general agreement between Paul's writings and Hebrews. I hope this gives you some understanding here of the mid-section in chapter 9, and hopefully the next time we'll finish up this chapter. Have a good week.